How's everybody doing out there? Welcome, Awesemo football fans. Terry McBride here. I'm going to take you through some of the new features and functions and just some general how-to on Fantasy Cruncher. They've run out some new updates recently, have had a little bit of an impact, and they've led to a lot of different questions, even from people who've been using the application for a long, long time. So we thought maybe it would be a good time to do a little bit of a deep dive, new tutorial video. It's been a while since we've done one of these at the site. If you're not a member at Awesemo.com, make sure to get signed up over at our site. We've got free memberships, of course, and we've got free content all the time, free tools and projections. But the best way to get behind the scenes is to get on one of our paid premium subscriptions. And you can do that by visiting Awesemo.com. We've got subscriptions for every different sport. Obviously, we're here to talk about the NFL and take a look at Fantasy Cruncher for the NFL. We host a version of Fantasy Cruncher on our website that you can add to any of our packages. So it's a very, very powerful tool when combined with our projections, with our data on ownership and leverage and top stacks and things of that nature. But it definitely has a pretty big learning curve, and it's something that we need to get into. So that's what we're here for. We're going to get through some of the basics on Fantasy Cruncher, talk about how to set up the application, and really help everybody get started. So this is our application, Fantasy Cruncher, and I'm just changing windows behind the scenes here. So the first thing to know is where to find it. So I've already pulled up the app so that we don't have to watch it load, but when you're on the home page or any of our web pages, that was clunky, you can jump over to the tools menu and you can always find all the different sports for Fantasy Cruncher from right here and all the different flavors within each sport. I told you guys we were going basic. We're starting basic. So that's where you can find the app. So we've loaded up Fantasy Cruncher. We're on the FanDuel version, but all of the stuff that we'll talk about carries over to DraftKings. And all the stuff that we'll talk about also, for the most part, carries from sport to sport. You don't really have a lot of different things within the settings, within the basic functionality of the app that are very different from sport to sport. There are a lot of things you want to do differently in terms of, in baseball, we want to be using the team stacks function. In football, we want to be using the groups function. In basketball, we want to be shooting for the highest level of optimization that we can possibly get within our lineups without really worrying about stacking players from certain teams or correlation between players. So there's a lot of different things that go into lineup building, and that's a lot of what we talk about at the site. That's a lot of what we talk about in Slack all the time. But Fantasy Cruncher is a tool, so it's going to do exactly what you ask it to do when we're building lineups. So that's the important thing to know, is what are we telling it to do? What does Fantasy Cruncher do for us? So the app is going to build us lineups based on a point per dollar algorithm. It's going to put together the best possible version of the lineup. So if you run a crunch with no changes to the basic settings, no randomness or anything like that, you will get what we call the optimal lineup. This is using Alex's Awesemo's projections from the site for this week of the NFL. I'm surprised to see two of my Giants players in there. Got a few questionable guys in there, of course, but these are early projections during the week. So it depends on what things come out in the wash where projections land. But we can see that that's a lineup that is put together, not following any rules or anything that have been put in because we haven't said anything. So this isn't necessarily the way that we would want to construct a lineup, but this is a lineup that gets dashed off for cash as having the highest projection. So that's an easy way to find the optimal. It comes in handy with basketball very much, just to find what the top construction of the night looks like. Run a lineup off the top without randomness. So just to get into how settings work within Fantasy Cruncher and what we want to do to get set up, the first thing that I like to look at is the advanced option. Well, excuse me. The first thing we need to do is go to the game filter and make sure that we've selected the right slate. I've already selected the main slate here, but the default is a choose slate, which is the Thursday to Monday 16 game, and you don't want to be crunching with that when you're building lineups for Sunday. If you do that, you're going to run into major problems uploading lineups with players who have played on Thursday, players that are included from the Monday games. So it's critical to make sure that you're selecting the correct slate up here. And then since we're talking about slates, when you export lineups, let me make one. When you export lineups, it's critical to make sure that you're selecting the correct slate for the export. Because if you select the wrong slate, your player IDs are going to be different and you are not going to be able to enter your upload. And speaking from experience, that is not a good feeling at 12:59 and 48 seconds on a Sunday morning when you got to get these things in for a 1 o'clock lock. So we want to make sure we're exporting the correct lineups. those are two key things about the slate. Those are two easy basics. They're things to do at the very beginning and the very end of your process. But we've got a lot of power within Fantasy Cruncher in terms of what the app can do for us. And a lot of that lives in the advanced options up here. So getting into all the advanced options, just starting from the very top over here in general, unique players per lineup. This setting is going to tell Fantasy Cruncher from lineup A to lineup B, as you're making a series of lineups, you must change at least this many players from one lineup to the next. So from lineup A to lineup B, if you select at least four of those players will be totally different players from the first lineup. And then lineup 3 from lineup 2, I think I've changed from A's and B's to 2s and 3s now, but the next lineup that it builds will be 4 players different from that second lineup that it built, but it might have 7, 8 players that are the same as the first lineup and only a few different from the first. So it gives it opportunity to create a shuffle and to create a variation of the players that are in your lineup, because we're always looking for unique lineups that are well constructed. So that's an important part of the puzzle here, is just choosing uniques. And it's something that it's a bit of personal preference. I typically will use 3, 4, 5, something like that for the NFL. Some people get aggressive and go all the way down to, the high numbers here. Some people like to keep a tight pool of lineups that don't change very much from one another. I like to cover a broad range of outcomes while still focusing on some of the apex lineups that are possible. So I tend to stay in this kind of a range where it'll swap out some of the teams. Typically, it'll swap out the main stack, and we'll get into how the stacks come together in a little bit. But typically, using that many will swap out the main stack as well as the run back play. So I like to get into that and force that. You can also do that positionally by using the unique players per position. So if there are only 2 running backs that you like, that you really want all week long, and you only want to force it to change wideouts, you can get it to a degree to do that here for you by just forcing extreme amounts of wideout and tight end changes. But this is one I typically would just not mess with too much, because I want my uniques to come from different places, and I don't want to restrict Fantasy Cruncher from what it can do. The more rules, the more settings, the more restrictions and ownership caps that we put in here, the fewer lineups Fantasy Cruncher will have access to, just by virtue of that's not a good combination based on what the user told me to put together. So again, anytime that you're getting issues with Fantasy Cruncher not producing enough lineups, giving you an error, producing lineups that not necessarily as highly projected as one might expect, it's probably because there are too many rules, restrictions, or settings that you've built into it. So it always pays to go back and just start stripping things off one by one if you run into that scenario. Some of the other things that are very powerful but can also get you into trouble on those kinds of front is the salary restrictions. You can set a minimum spend, you can set a maximum spend. Typically, this is something I'll leave blank. This is not something I really care about. A lot of people will set if it's a $60,000 cap, a lot of people will set this max to $59,900 so that there's at least $100 left on the table, and you're just getting a little bit different from everybody who is trying to spend all of their salary and maximize their spend. So that's one way to do that. You could go to 59.4, whatever you want to do there, but I don't find it totally necessary, and I think it's somewhat restrictive. And the way that I build lineups with randomness and with our groups, it's typically going to be building a lot of lineups, and whether it leaves salary on the table or not, it will be a well-constructed lineup that is playable. And the way that I approach these things is to build a pool of about 500 to 1,000 lineups and then run it through a sorting tool in Excel and pull out my top 150. So I'm willing to take on some additional lineups that have maybe not a full salary spend, maybe a different kind of construction, because they'll go into the pool and they'll get sorted out anyway. Looking down the line here, you can see we can assign which players are allowed to appear at the flex position. A lot of people like to take tight end out of that. I don't find that all that necessary, because the few tight ends that do tend to pop up in the flex position are tight ends that I would be willing to play in the flex position anyway. But you can certainly do that here. You can take everybody out of it. If you wanted to run only running backs, you would just do that, and it would only give you running backs at your flex spot. Again, probably something that will create some restriction around the total spend, because it will be looking for 3 fairly high-end, high-priced running backs for you, and it'll fill out those spots. So you'll get some lower-end wideouts. You'll get some lower-end combinations in there. Offensive players versus defense. This is an important one to a degree in football. Just saying, if I've got the Miami Dolphins defense, how many players do I want to allow from the Raiders this week? I'm glad that was on the screen so I could see who they were playing as I was making the example. So if I set this to, I always leave this at 0 unless we're talking about a very, very small slate. If you set it to 1, it will allow a maximum of 1 player from the Raiders to appear against the Miami defense, and that goes for any defense that you have, of course. So that's a fairly basic concept. I usually leave it at 0. I don't typically want to have offensive players against my defense, again, unless it's a very small slate or something along those lines. The global exposure setting. Calculate how that's calculated is interesting. This refers to where we cap individual exposures, individual players with ownership. And we can see that when we jump out of this screen in a minute. But let's just say I have it set so I want no more than 25% of any quarterback, right? And that's a little high, but we'll just use that as the example. If I want less than 25% of any quarterback, and I leave this with after each lineup is created, that means if the first lineup uses Tom Brady cannot then be used again until the 5th lineup, because he can only be used in 25% of the total lineups that the app has created along the way. And it's going to calculate that each time for you. So it will force a bit of a shuffle, but it will also potentially leave out some lineups. The slower way to do it, especially if you're crunching like 500 lineups, is to do it with based on number of lineups requested. And what that's going to do is going to allow the app to build just the most pure versions of each of these constructions, each of these lineups, without really caring, all right, I just used Tom Brady in that previous one. Now I can't use him again until the 5th one. It won't do that. It will just make sure that by the end, it has gotten the maximum of 25% Tom Brady. So it's an interesting way to create lineups. I am somewhat leaning into this version based on number of lineups requested in later times, in more recent times. I think it does a more efficient job of getting to the best versions of each lineup without worrying about those ownership issues. The only problem with it is it dramatically slows down the process. So if you're crunching at 12:30 for a 1 o'clock lock, probably best to stick to the after each lineup is created. And we can see that Fantasy Cruncher can speed up and slow down to a degree based on what you ask it to do, just like the concept of it can't necessarily do all of these things that you ask it to do with rules and restrictions. If you give it a lot of rules and restrictions and caps that it has to think about in putting lineups together, it's going to take more time to create each lineup. Kind of follows. Randomness. Randomness is a biggie. You guys will maybe notice that I am using the standard version of Fantasy Cruncher. I actually prefer our standard version, but we do feature the Pro upgrade, which you can see in the background here in the top right corner over here. You can click on that and you can upgrade to the Pro version. Our hosted version, for those who may not know, is the full version of Fantasy Cruncher. It is the one that allows you to crunch out to 500 lineups at a time, combine multiple sets of crunches into massive pools of entries. It is not the light version, but we do have an add-on that adds newer features from Fantasy Cruncher, such as Pro Randomness, which puts your randomness on a bell curve and gives you a more accurate distribution of where your randomness falls. Auto Groups Creator, which is self-explanatory, helps you create groups automatically, and access to DraftKings Lineup Study. Those are the 3 primary features that are featured in Pro. Very worth doing if you're a DraftKings player who likes to do a lot of research on how lineups were built for the contest. You might have seen Josh and Adam looking at that during NBA season quite a bit the next day after a contest runs to see what people were doing with their lineups. It's a very powerful tool. The Pro Randomness is also very powerful. The standard version of Randomness, which you always want to, or I at least always turn on for football, and I have Randomness that I put in. The standard version of Randomness will take the projection of each player. Let's say we have a player projected for 10 FanDuel points, and we have randomness assigned at 50%. Every time Fantasy Cruncher crunches the lineup, it will calculate a randomized projection within that range that you've given it. So 50% of 10 being 5, that means that every time Fantasy Cruncher calculates a lineup for that player, and for each player within that lineup creation, it will have a random version of the projection within that range that you've given it. So from 5 to 15, plus or minus 5 in each direction from the original 10 projection. So that's how the classic randomness works. And it gives you a number that at any point within that range. So you might get a 5.62, you might get a 14.98. And this changes obviously how that player is viewed within that lineup. It creates a much bigger shuffle of players, much bigger shuffle of lineups. It's a very powerful tool in helping get some of the lower owned, maybe less likely, but players that are somewhat mandatory for large scale GPPs into your lineups, getting to third wideouts, for example, who are not necessarily highly projected, but could go off and score that one big touchdown on a 78-yard passing play that breaks the slate. So that's a good way to help you get to those players. There are other things that we'll do that will also help you get to those players as we go along. The minimum projection included in the calculation is very self-explanatory. If you set this to 3, nobody who's projected under 3 will be able to appear in any lineups. If you set it to 12, same story. Nobody under 12 will be able to project to land in any of your lineups. DVP settings, this is just a fantasy cruncher setting as to how many weeks of defense versus position statistics it's going to display for you in there. It's not something that I worry about. It's also not our data from the site. It's just statistical data. Fantasy Cruncher does a good job of aggregating a lot of statistics within the dashboard here. They also provide their own projections, which we're going to get into in a moment. It's important to know the difference between the projection sets, and that if you're getting your Fantasy Cruncher through Awesemo.com, you have our projections, Awesemo's projections, and Awesemo's ownership uploaded into the app automatically for you. And I'll show you shortly how to use those, how to make sure that you're crunching with the right set. But Fantasy Cruncher also does have their own in-house set of projections that are here for use and certainly can be utilized if you so choose. They've also built in a new tool that we'll look at momentarily to globally adjust those projections. But there is an important detail in selecting which set of projections that you want to use that we should actually, I'm going to close this momentarily, we should take a look at. Actually, let me show you this first. To start with, the new tool that Fantasy Cruncher added just recently, just in week 2, is this. It's the global projection sliders. It's a very cool tool for adjusting projections on the fly. As you can see, it's got a big slider here. It's got sliders for projected score for each team, right? So you've got the Titans, you've got the Colts up here. So I can increase the projected score. Let's say I don't agree with Vegas. And as you can see, it's adjusting the number of offensive plays, the pass attempts, the rush attempts, the Fantasy Cruncher's algorithm expects, and then it makes global adjustments to all of the player projections from these teams. So again, these are adjusting Fantasy Cruncher's projections. These are not adjusting Awesemo's projections. But it's a pretty cool tool that they built in here. And you can do that different ways, right? Let's say, all right, I think that they're still going to, I think it was 21 and change, right? Whatever it was. So we'll lower that back down to normal. You can also do it based on, all right, I think that this game is going to be more pass heavy for the Colts. So I'm going to slide this guy up that way, but not necessarily more scoring. I just think they're going to pass a little bit more. And then I think maybe that the Titans are going to focus on the run game a little bit more. So we can slide it this way. And as you can see, like I said, same concept. It's making changes for you globally and automatically to Fantasy Cruncher's projections. It's a pretty cool app. You can change the percentage of target share for receivers. I think AJ is going to get more of the focus here. So pretty cool. You can see Henry's already getting the lion's share of running. Let's say Henry gets 100% of the carries. That's what he looks like. Right? And it's making all these adjustments. So as you adjust these things, the projections that you get from Fantasy Cruncher are adjusting in the background. So if I go to, so we can see here for Derrick Henry, the original Fantasy Cruncher projection, and this is where you find these. The FC is a Fantasy Cruncher's projection. So the original is 21.86. After those silly adjustments I just made with the sliders, the new version of Fantasy Cruncher's projection is 23.34, a plus 1.48 differential. So they give you all the original, your adjusted, and the differential. One last time, these are Fantasy Cruncher's projections. Awesemo's projections are over here. Okay? Proj is by default, if you're getting the app through our website, Proj projections is Awesemo's projections. it will default to having Awesemo's projections in my proj as well. But if you upload something else, say you're running your own set of projections, say you've got a membership to another website and they have projections and you want to use those for crunches as well, that's very easy to do via the upload data tool. I'll show you guys that in a little bit. But those projections will then land in my proj. So you'll have sets that are Fantasy Crunchers projections, my, which is your adjusted version of Fantasy Crunchers projections if you use that tool. Then you'll have proj, which is still Alex's Awesemo's projections. And then you'll have my proj, which is the projections that you uploaded. So it's important to know the difference between these projection sets, particularly when you're going to run a crunch, because you have to choose which set you want to use. And the nomenclature here is not the easiest. FC proj fantasy points is what we just saw. It's the default version before you adjust any sliders of Fantasy Crunchers projections. My proj fantasy points, this top one, this is critical. This is this one. This is your version of the adjusted Fantasy Cruncher projections. So if you want to use Awesemo's projections, that is not the one to select. If you want to use our projections and you have not uploaded anything into Fantasy Cruncher, you can use either use Awesemo projections, kind of easy, or you can use my projections, and that will default to giving you this column, which again starts out as the same as ours from the site. But if you upload something, you'll be telling it to use the ones that you uploaded. Very important difference between my projection, use my projections, and new my proj fantasy points. A little bit difficult to figure out for the new user. So something definitely wanted to point out there. I think we covered that in great detail, and everybody knows how to select the correct set of projections. If you guys don't, if you run into trouble out there and you're a member at the site, come into Slack. We've got the DFS 101 channel. We've got the NFL channel. We've got a ton of really helpful members and a good community going on in there. And we're also all hanging out. So all of the guys from the site are hanging around, answering questions, talking shop all day. So jumping back into advanced options, it's the same menu that we were in just before. Just a couple other things that are on this main screen. You can set a maximum players from each team for each game locally, players from game maximum, limit opposing players, and you can do that individually for each game here. We can get into that. I do that via rules and position stacks here, and we'll get into that shortly as well. But I typically just leave this open at 4 and then handle all of those things through rules. You can save all of these settings. So once you've gone through all the different tabs that we're going to look at, you want to definitely save these things. Next week, you come back, you just load them. Bang, they're right there. Something really helpful that FC added as well in this new update, you can restore default settings, and it's not just a global restore. You can get in here and granularly say, all right, I need to restore. All right, it's not giving me enough lineup, so I need to take off the randomness. I need to take off the exposures and start stripping away some of these things without stripping away all of your groups, let's say, all of your my data, all of your different stacks that you built or what have you. So giving you the ability to strip off different settings and restore them to default, that granularly is powerful and helpful from Fantasy Cruncher. So I think we covered all of the general options here. We covered what the new projection slider tool does for Fantasy Crunchers projections, and you can do this game by game for all the different games if you want to. Powerful tool, very cool. Position stacks. This is critical for football. This is going to be the place where we build our rules to limit and restrict or force specific types of constructions. So what we want to do here, there's 2 tabs. There's stacks and there's limits. So this is the yes do. This is the no don't do, basically. So to start with stacks, we can tell Fantasy Cruncher, I'm going to stack any position with at least exactly or at most any amount of any other selected position from the same team, the opposing team, or the same game. We can tell it to exclude or include specific teams along with that rule. So what you want to do here, and then, well, I'll create a rule so you guys can see. What we want to do here is this is where we force what our constructions look like, what our builds look like. And without getting too deep into how to construct a lineup for NFL DFS, What we do want to focus on is things like stacking quarterbacks with pass catchers. Typically, I will recommend, and a lot of the guys from the site recommend, using a run back play. Not a running back necessarily, but a run back, what we call a run back, referring to a player from the opposing team, with the idea that if we're building around a quarterback and one of his pass catchers, with the idea that they're going to go off and score 3 or 4 touchdowns for us, the quarterback throws 4 touchdown passes, one receiver catches 2 of them, everybody's going to have a nice day. That may, to a degree, require some scoring from the other team. Typically, teams will slow down if they've got a 26-point lead, 28-point lead, 26, weird, what a weird number to arrive on for NFL. Typically, if a team's got a 28-point lead, they're going to slow down and just grind out the clock, so they're not going to be slinging the ball around anymore. So you need those other players from the opposing team to kind of force the action for your top stacks. So that's something I like to build in with a rule as well. So let's look at how to build that rule. I want to stack quarterback with at least one of, and I'll make this one just wide receiver and tight end. And we can put running back in here, certainly. There's justification for that. You can do running backs individually through groups and add them. That's the way that I prefer to handle the running backs for the most part, because then you can get really, really specific about which pass catching running backs, third down backs, guys like that you'll want to have in there in stacks, where you don't necessarily want to have like a Derrick Henry, Ryan Tannehill stack, although Henry sees a few targets. It's not necessarily the same concept, where if you have a 7-8 target running back who is going to be involved heavily in the passing game, he is essentially another receiver. So there is a distinction there. So let's just go with wideouts and tight ends for this one. We're saying at least one. You can do this to at least 2 if you want to get aggressive about things. High scoring, highly total Vegas game, expected shootout. That's certainly fine. Just know that you're going to be forcing a very, very specific construction. So from same team, and then we just click add stacking rule. You see it pops up down here. Nice and easy. So you can go in here and use if I wanted to, let's say I want to set the same rule, but I want to exclude, I don't want to have any stacks from my Giants for whatever reason, right? That would do that, and it would say stack quarterback with at least one wide receiver tight end from the same team, exclude the Giants. That's easy. The other thing we want to do here is you want to say, all right, so for the run back now, I want to say quarterback with at least one player, wide receiver, tight end. And for this one, I will typically include running back, because I do think that a bell cow running back, somebody who's going to see a ton of carries, get in the end zone a couple of times, he can have that same impact. It's lessened, and that's something I also handle through groups, is the degree to which I'll get a running back in that spot. It is lessened, the degree to which you want them and that they'll force action, but I think it is important to leave them in there. So I'll do that typically. And then all we need to do here is just change this to opposing team, and bang, drop the same rule down there. All right, so I deleted our one that we had before. So eventually what you'll want is something that looks like this, where there's a bunch of different rules that are created here. And I write a weekly article that focuses on rules, limits, and then groups. I give the group recommendations for every team. I say which key player I'm using. It's always the quarterback, hint, hint. And I let the quarterbacks drive our lineup constructions. And within that article, I give my various stacking rules, my various limit rules. So what you'll see, I'm going to load my previously saved settings here so you guys can see how these look, if it wants to load for me. Come on. Yeah. So here you can see these are ones that I just have saved. And some weeks, depending on game flow, depending on what's going on, I'll turn these off, turn these on. But you can see I have a decent amount of rules in here because I want to do very specific things. Like I want to limit wide receivers, running backs, and tight ends from the same team to one player. And what this says underneath that streaming thing that I think you guys can see is unless paired with quarterback from same team. And you can see that up here as well. Limit wide receivers from same team to one unless paired with quarterback or opposing quarterback. I don't typically want 2 wideouts from, let's say, the Atlanta Falcons if I don't have Matt Ryan as my quarterback. Kind of makes sense. If those 2 different receivers are going to go off to the degree that they're going to be relevant to a winning lineup, then odds are pretty strong that Matt Ryan's going to be the quarterback in that winning lineup. So that'll force that construction to limit those wideouts. Limiting the volume of players from the same team, totally the same concept. You want to turn this off if you're building larger groups, larger stacks. I don't like running a quarterback with his defense. Certainly don't like running a quarterback into the opposing defense, but our previous setting from general, where we're saying no offensive players against the team defense, will take care of that. Typically, a high-scoring quarterback might force his defense to be on the field a little bit too much for me, where it's not necessarily creating all the defensive opportunity one might expect. That's a personal preference one. It's certainly fine to play it with the same team's defense. You can see that win as well. You can see a defense create a couple turnovers, give his quarterback some good opportunities, and not get too tired from being on the field. Limit running back from same team to one player is something that I like to do. Again, not totally mandatory, but I find it effective in just keeping out bad constructions. More than it forces something good, it keeps out bad stuff. So, and that's a limit rule, which is on this other tab, which I was about to jump to. These function the exact same way, except they create rules like that one. Limit the running backs from the same team to one player. So limit, if I wanted to say, limit the number of wide receivers from the same game to 3, right? I don't want to ever have it where I've got 4 wideouts, 2 from each team, or 3 from one team and 1 from another team from the same game to 3. You can pop that in there. You could say limit it to limit wide receivers from the same game to 3 unless paired with quarterback or opposing quarterback, right? So these are all just logic rules. So all you have to do is think it through, and it very much is how you would say it. All right, this is what I want to do. I want to limit this from this to that unless this and this or that, and you've got a lot of different choices in here that you can do it positionally. So if for some strange reason I wanted to, let's say, limit tight ends from the same game to 2. Well, we can only ever have 2. Limit tight ends from the same game to 1 unless paired with the opposing running back. You can do weird stuff like that, right? That's how you would do that. There's no rhyme or reason to that rule or to that limit, but you can create something like that if you wanted to. Don't do that rule. I don't think it makes any sense. So that's stacks and limits. That's going to have a major impact on what your lineup shapes look like and how these constructions come together. So let's see. Got randomness turned on. And you can see some of my default stuff loaded up here. I'm going to change that guy to 4. My default was 4.2. Not really sure why. 3 is fine. Less higher is fine as well. Actually might lower that now that I think about it. So just coming off the top here again, now that we've got those settings in place, actually, I'm going to turn off randomness for this one just to see, based on our rules and our limits, that'll force a specific lineup construction. As you can see, this one gave us naked Lamar, gave us a pair of Giants without a quarterback and without a run back from that game. So this is a lineup that, while it came off the top as technically the optimal by projection, it's not necessarily following the construction that we want, the style that we want. So I turn randomness off so that we can see, all right, with those rules and limits, and hopefully I didn't screw anything up so it'll be embarrassing and tell me I can't build a lineup. But with those rules and limits, when I click go on a non-randomized lineup, what's my new version that follows that construction? So let's see if we get something. So there we go. So now we can see this lineup comes in. It's projected 2 points, 2 and change points lower, spending 59.8, which I like, not spending the full amount. And this is giving me something specific to that construction that I requested. It's giving me Josh Allen, a premium quarterback, with Cole Beasley, one of his top wide receivers. It's forcing Antonio Gibson in here based on our construction request that we get a run back play, and we allowed it to use running backs there. So it gave us Gibson, which I'm fine with. But, if we had gotten Terry McLaurin instead of Chris Godwin or Cooper Kupp and a different running back, that would have been okay as well, and also would have been following the rules. So that would have been a possibility. But this was the one off the top with no randomness. And then we can see that it's just building a solid lineup the rest of the way here by filling in around the edges. We've got Joe Mixon. We've got a running back in the flex position. We've got a premium tight end. Now, this is in an ownership vacuum, of course, and we haven't dealt with leverage or anything like that. But as we can see, this is building us a lineup that is conceptually more along the lines of what we're looking for with a stack, with a run back, and how we want a lineup built.
Not to say that this one is bad, couldn't win by any means, but getting two of these Giants in here, as a Giants fan, I can tell you, without their quarterback, that's probably not the greatest of moves. So, all right, that's what they look like without randomness on. And then just to round out the experiment, we'll turn randomness back on, and we'll see something that's very far afield probably from what those two constructions look like. So we get a Kyler lineup. This one's projected at 136.87, a little bit lower than that one. Still gets a Saquon. We're still getting Cooper Kupp, but we're getting Kyler and Rondale Moore now. They're playing Jacksonville, so we got James Robinson coming as the run back play. And what I'll do is, just so we can see it at wide out, that one. Quarterback, at least one wide receiver, tight end from opposing. Put that rule back. So all I did there was just change that default rule that I have, and I'm taking the running back out of the opposing team run back so we can see one that comes together with wideouts. So I'll hit that go again. All right, so we get a Mahomes one. Mahomes with Mecole Hardman. They're playing the Chargers, so we get Keenan Allen coming back as the run back play. That's pretty powerful. Still another Saquon lineup. He's just, I guess, strongly projected for a good price this week. Joe Mixon coming through here, right? And we can see it's just very much along the lines of what we requested Fantasy Cruncher to build for us. So rules and limits, very, very powerful tool, particularly when combined with some of these other things that we're going to look at. Team stacks. Good news, we're not going to go through this one too much. This one is far more important for baseball and hockey, in my opinion. You absolutely can use it, and the way that you do use it is by clicking Add Team Stack over here. And you can see all of these different options pop up for all the different teams at each game. And this is just telling Fantasy Cruncher who I want to allow to be stacked from these teams, right? So for baseball or for hockey, this is much more powerful, where we're looking to capture specific correlated hitters within a lineup without necessarily caring which ones they are. In football, I like to do this via the rules in the position stacks tab, the rules, the limits, and then the groups that we're going to look at next. It's just a lot clunkier to do it through the team stacks tool, I think. And you've got a lot of clicking to do, just going through, all right, this one I want to allow the quarterback, the running back. Not that our groups work is going to be any less cumbersome, but I just think it's more effective, more granular, more powerful to use it through groups. But this is where you find team stacks. If this were baseball, you would see, the two baseball teams, all the different lineup spots 1 through 9 over here, the positions over here, same as the position selections are here. And you choose the stack size, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on DK for talking baseball again. Choose the stack size. In baseball, there's another function that's the gap between hitters. So you can go 1, 2, 3, 4, and if you say no gaps, that means it's not allowed to put somebody in there. If you say one gap, it can go 1, 2, 3, 5. There's a gap between the 3 and the 5 hitter, right? So that's team stacks in a nutshell, but we're not going to go too deep into it here. Catch the Baseball FC video that will inevitably cut before next baseball season to get deeper into team stacks. Or just ask me, find me in Slack, send us an email. Happy to help anytime. Groups are powerful. This is another thing that is a big part of the process for football. And this is what I write my weekly article about. You can find my recommendations. They usually come out on Fridays, Friday afternoon, Friday evening. And then I run an update for first thing on Sunday morning after staying up all night crunching 50,000 or so lineups, giving everybody the recommended groups, any news updates for in, out, et cetera, and recommended boosts. And we'll take a look at what boosts are. But if you want to cut to the chase and just, hey, give me the down and dirty, who do I need to put into these groups and what do I need to do with it? I'm doing that legwork for you guys. You can also use the auto groups creator if you have pro here. It's powerful. It will set these up for you very, very quickly, but you have to be careful what you're asking it to do. Like with Fantasy Cruncher as a whole, auto groups creator is a tool. It is only going to give you what you ask it to. So no saying Fantasy Cruncher gave me this. You ask Fantasy Cruncher for that. That's my general rule when people say, well, Fantasy Cruncher gave me a bad lineup. You ask Fantasy Cruncher for that bad lineup. So it's important to know how these things work, guys. So getting into groups, I clicked as I was talking there. I clicked the create new group button over here, right? Pretty easy. Let's go call it Arizona. Right. So we want to make a group for Arizona. So you can search for the team here and just pull up all the cards players. That's easy and a simple way to get to it. You can find individual players. You can find specific positions. These are fairly self-explanatory. What the groups do is allow you to put together players. And what we want to do is designate a key player. I'm going to make Kyler Murray the key player. For NFL, it's always for me the quarterback. You can do other things with this, and we'll get into that in a second. But for me, this is what drives our group creation and our stack creation, is saying, all right, the quarterback for each team is the key player. And then I want to go to his skill players. And I want to take DeAndre. Chase Edmonds gets a decent amount of targets. I want to go Rondell Moore, AJ Green, Christian Kirk, Max Williams. All right, let's pretend like Max is a relevant part of the offense. Right, so that's basically the core of primary skill players. So what we want to do is we want to just say, if Kyler Murray is used, that's what the key player means. If Fantasy Cruncher creates a group that has Kyler Murray in it, then it has to use at least one of the players within this group. So what that's going to do is that's going to work hand in hand with our requirement to use at least one wide receiver, tight end, skill player along with a quarterback. And it's going to say specifically, I only want it to be drawn from this group. Because we've got it limited to how many guys from the team it can take, it will not give you guys that are not in the group. So this can become too restrictive if you don't set these up correctly. But it's very, very powerful for getting granular and getting specific about who I want in these groups. I use this for every single team. And what I do in addition is not only do I build the Arizona group like that, I also build an opponent group. And I think this is even more powerful, where I once again make Kyler the key. So I want the Arizona quarterback is the key, but now I'm going to go to Jacksonville players and I put Jacksonville players in my group. Right. So let's say, all right, James is decent there. Marvin, Chanel, DJ Shark, but maybe not necessarily Carlos Hyde, maybe not necessarily the tight end. Maybe not necessarily some of the lower end dart throws. And this varies team to team, player to player, projection to projection on who you want to get in there. Like if you had stuck Cordell Patterson into your Atlanta groups, which I had, it was a powerful play because it wasn't, the most popular play in the world, but it was forcing a lower end guy into some of your constructions. Right. So what creating the opposing group is going to do now is say, again, if Kyler is the key, it's going to force, based on the rules and the limits that we set, it's going to force it to use a run back. But now that I've got the group, it's going to say you can only use one of these 4 guys that are listed here as my run back play. Now to do something like, all right, I'm getting, since he's the highest projected guy, we saw one of the lineups that we ran off before that came up with Kyler, had James Robinson in the run back play as a running back. Typically, like I was saying earlier, running back plays can work in that spot, but typically I prefer to put them into the passing game for the most part. But I don't want to totally restrict any James Robinson groups by lineups by telling it you can't use him here. So what you can do is put a negative boost into James Robinson. So if I want to say whenever Kyler Murray is the key player, whenever Kyler Murray appears in a lineup, James Robinson is included in the group of potential run back plays for that stack. But I want to give him a negative 25% bump to his projection. I want to knock this down so that he's a little bit more even with these guys. So he's coming up at around the same amount, maybe a little bit less than any of my receivers. So that's going to knock him down to a level with those guys where you're going to get a much better and more equitably distributed mix of these players. The more players you have in here, the broader the mix will be. Some of these guys, like let's say I wanted to put Laquan Treadwell in here. You're still not going to get much Laquan Treadwell because his projection is 1.24. He's at 4,500 though. So if you juice his projection by a couple 100% and get him to a spot where he's much more likely to appear in lineups, that's how you get a guy like that. You can also go with very heavy randomness on guys like that and force them that way as well. So that's boost, and you can go positive or negative with boosts. Like let's say I'm not getting enough DJ Shark, but I don't want to blow him out of the water and launch him into a 15-point range. But if I go up plus 15%, that might nudge him up a little bit in terms of where I'm getting him versus like a cheaper Laviska Shenault who's projected higher. So this is just a little bit of push and pull, give and take throughout your lineups. This is what I'm looking at for each team when I'm writing the groups. When I said, like I said, I crunch about 50,000 lineups. I go through for each team. I look at the distributions on, all right, how many shares of the running back am I getting? How many shares of the third pass catcher am I getting? Do I want to make adjustments to that? And that's when I provide the boost recommendations. That's what those do. You can save these, fortunately, thankfully. You want to go to the import export groups down here. And you just want to go to this button down at the bottom, download, save groups as local file, download file. And what that'll do is just create a little export here for you. It comes out as a DAT file. There's absolutely no reason in the world to open that file. Just save it locally. It'll go into your downloads folder or wherever you direct your downloads. And you just want to have that handy for when you need to put these back. Let's say you built them on Monday, and for whatever reason, when you came back on Saturday morning to start building some lineups, lo and behold, they're gone. Fantasy Cruncher pushing an update, whatever the case may be. They're not there anymore. You don't have to rebuild them. You've saved them. You can go in and sorry, I hit the wrong one. I hit the import selected groups. That's not what we want. We want up here the upload groups file, and you just grab it from there. Right? Easy enough, and you can upload your settings. What I like to do is at least have all of the core team groups saved. So I can pull back each team, and any week-to-week changes, I'll go through one by one and make the week-to-week changes. Let's say DeAndre got hurt. You would obviously want to take him out of this group. Go through that, and then each week, since it's a different opponent, you're going to be creating the opponent groups fresh. Again, something that you can do quicker through Auto Group Creator, but you still are going to want to go through it and make sure that you're getting the right players and you're getting the right combinations. This is where you can also set some of these things to another. If it's a game of a very high Vegas total, you could say I want to use at least 2 from this group. You can say I want to use at least 1. You can say I want to use at most, exactly, or between. So it's pretty powerful. Between is good. You can say, all right, I want to use between 1 and 2, which is the same as saying at least 2, or at most 2 rather. Oh no, actually it's not, because you're telling it you have to use at least 1, but no more than 2. So that's a good setting, actually. I like that. This clicker, this little checkbox down here tells it ignore this part, right? It says only apply key plus or minus adjustments. So if any key player used, then it's telling it cut that off, ignore this. You don't have to use one of these guys, but you do have to apply these adjustments. So let's say I had a minus 15, plus, right? You want to force some of these guys up, force some of these guys down. This is saying to ignore the using rule and only apply the adjustments anytime Kyler is the key player. And where that comes in handy is if you wanted to do things like specific player groups where I got this specific wideout. Now I want to have one of guys from this pool of wide receivers. Let's say you wanted to force a specific group of inexpensive wideouts every time you got DeAndre Hopkins in there. You could take these guys out, obviously. You would key DeAndre, take Kyler out of here. Right? This is a totally different kind of group. Right? If you did that and you say, all right, I want to use specific other wideouts. Let's say every time I get DeAndre, I want to scroll down here and grab some of the, let me sort this by projection. You can change what you sort all these things by, kind of obvious there. Helps to find guys for something like this. So let's say I want to use only guys that I think might be underpriced here. So you can start saying like, all right, I think, maybe a Cole Beasley, 5,400 is underpriced because DeAndre is very expensive, right? So you can tell it, all right, I want to try and make a core of lower priced guys. I'm just going to pick some guys at random instead of actually looking at what these projections and prices are, because that doesn't actually matter for the conversation we're having. All right, so I've got a little group here. Ignore who these guys are and what their projections look like. But what we're trying to do here is say, all right, if I got a lineup with DeAndre, I want to give these guys nudges by a decent amount so that I can kind of not tell it that it has to use one of these guys, but that it's just going to be more likely to pick up some of the value guys. And you can make this group bigger, so you can use all the reasonably expected $5,000 wide receivers in here if you wanted to. And you're not forcing it. You're not saying you have to because this is on. You're just saying, all right, apply these bumps. if I get DeAndre, I know I'm going to need to save some money somewhere. And I don't necessarily want the worst defense in the league by default and the worst tight end available by default because it's using all excellent skill position players. I think there's value in getting to a Cole Beasley or an Emmanuel Sanders or one of these guys, KJ Osborne, to get away from the Bills offense for a second. So I'm going to bump these guys up every time I get DeAndre in a lineup. They'll come into a significant amount more of your lineups that have DeAndre that way. Not all of them necessarily, but the lion's share of them will have these guys in them. So that's how you can force a little bit of value. People like to know where you can do stuff like that. You can disable all the groups. That's fairly obvious. You can also create little folders here if you're into organization. You could say teams, and then you could have another one for opponents. And then you could just move that guy into there. Oh, that's right. You have to open them before you can drop something into them. Anyway, so obviously I'm not into organization. So that's how you create groups. My data is another tab. This is one that I don't use a ton, but this is a great tool if you're, let's say, uploading our boom bust tool or our top stacks or something like that. You wanted to crunch, or you wanted to allow a minimum or a maximum amount of leverage or ownership or anything like that. Maximum of 75 of not thumbs up or down, but any of these different things. So Fantasy Cruncher's got a bunch of default stuff in here that you can use. So like, let's say, all right, I want an ownership sum no more than 150. That would do that. Right? Using projected ownership, each lineup must have a maximum of 150 total. That'll create the ownership sum. It'll calculate the ownership based on the ownership projection from Awesemo for each player, and it will restrict them from being over, let's say, 150. That was a random number because I don't use this all that often. So our ownership on these was 106, 109, 139 for the one that came off the top, 137 for the second most optimal one. So you can see already when we used randomness, these created much lower owned lineups that are still projected very much in line with the optimal, with the second optimal that we ran with once we built our constructions, and they're following along our preferred construction path. So you just kind of see the power of using the groups and the randomness there. So that's what my data does. You can add, if you upload your own data via the upload data tool, then those things that you upload will be in here as well. So that's where I'm saying if you upload, let's say, the boom bust tool, you can say a maximum or minimum boom percentage of X, because boom bust will be a setting in here. The way to upload data is right here. It's in our upload button. All right. Fairly basic. Player name, projection. So again, projection here is going to replace my proj, the column my proj over here that was next to Awesemo's projection. That will change that my proj column from Awesemo's projection to your projection. Awesemo's projection will still be available in the proj column. Gets a little confusing. So anything that you put in here, you can change global exposures and randomness. These are the defaults, and then you can drop anything that you want. So like, let's say you wanted to add the boom bust. You just do that. Add, remove a column. Takes a sec. So it dropped it over here on the end, right? So now we've got a value for boom. Let's just say. Patrick Mahomes has an amazing chance to boom this week, apparently, right? So I upload that. And now you can see my boom percentage column appeared in Fantasy Cruncher here. And Patrick Mahomes got his value of 5,555. So that's how to use the upload data tool. Late swap optimizer is a whole other conversation. That's a ridiculously powerful tool that everybody should be using after lock, but I don't have a CSV to drop in there to show you guys late swap optimizer. What it can do is just help you globally make swaps at positions. You can pull up your entire slate of lineups and make individual swaps, review your various lineups. The way to do that, just to show you guys real quick, if you want to take your lineups that you've put in to the slate locks, it's 105. But I want to look through my different lineups, see what I've got, see if there's any better changes that I can make. See what I didn't necessarily look at each individual of the 150 lineups when they came out of Fantasy Cruncher. So let me get back to those. So what you want to do, you got to go to the game filter and you take out any of the games that started at 1 because you're not going to be able to change any of those and it'll give you problems. You go to advanced options. You take your salary minimum and just set it to, it'll just do like that. Give it something that it can't possibly do, right? And it'll break Fantasy Cruncher when it tries to upload the lineups through the late swaptimizer tab, which you do through here. You go to late swaptimizer, you select a CSV, and then you just tell it to upload. It will immediately say, I can't crunch any new lineups, but it will give you the full display in Fantasy Cruncher of all the lineup cards of the ones that you did build. So you'll have all this for the lineups that you've got in the tournament. And then you can make your changes, you re-export it, it comes out with all the entry information still there so that it's not crossing up, so that you're not accidentally saving one lineup over a different one. You're saving straight line. This lineup I want to replace with this new version of that lineup, and it's got all the entry data in there. What you guys can't see is that I'm like pointing at stuff and I'm not on camera. So I think we covered that. Restore crunches. This is pretty easy. If you've accidentally deleted one, you can restore it. You can recover deleted tabs, autosave. I recommend always telling it to autosave so that you can get back to work that you've accidentally killed. Or at times you'll have to reload Fantasy Cruncher to catch an update, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a great way to make sure that you don't lose things, is by using the restore crunch. What else can we look at? All these new stats and everything that dropped into Fantasy Cruncher. There was a lot of information in the dashboard here. If you've still got all that information, what you want to do, and it was this stuff, and you'll see it pop up in a second. All right, this puts a bunch of additional info in between where our projections are all the way over here now, and just where the screen starts all the way over here. So I took that stuff out, and they gave us the option to take that out. The default after the new update was that it was there and that these were unchecked. So for me, what I had to do to get it to disappear was just check these like they are now and then uncheck them again. And then that data went away. So again, all good data, I'm sure. Certainly there's a reason that Fantasy Cruncher put it there. Not saying that it's not something you want to look at. I'm saying that it makes it easier to get to where we want to be with our data and with our ownership and with our tools, our randomness, our exposure caps, and all of that. That's worth talking about. If you want to do individual randomness, this is where you set it for each different player. You can upload it globally through the upload data tool, or you can just also in the randomness, if I want everybody at 75%, to do that, 75, I hit the change all players button. And now we've got 75% randomness on everybody. Same thing with exposures. You can do it globally. You can do it individually. You can go player by player, position by position, get to the different groups of players and make any of your changes. For me, I typically like to use less randomness on running backs, heavy randomness on quarterbacks and pass catchers. And then I'll take what I get on defense for the most part. That varies slate to slate, player to player in a lot of cases. For lower projected players, you need to use heavier randomness if you're on the classic randomness to force them up into additional amounts of lineups. You can do other things in Fantasy Cruncher. It's got the thumbs up to change player projections. For those that don't know, that's basically what the thumbs up do. It just changes every thumbs up like. This gives him a bump by 8% to his projection. You can go out to 3 of those. You can take them away. Same thing with the downs. Takes away 8% of the projection. So that's just kind of a down and dirty way to alter a player's projection if you're getting too much, too little of them. And let's see, the player pool, the contest data, that's all pretty basic, straightforward stuff about what you're getting from FanDuel and what you could potentially enter into. This is actually important. I mentioned earlier, I run several sets of crunches with different configurations. So a lot of people never really realized if you run multiple crunches, let's say there's 500 lineups in this tab, I've got the other tab open over there. You just do this. Select lineups, all the selected lineups, you can move them, right? And now that just moves that one over to here. Pretty basic and straightforward. But where that comes in handy is, let's say you want to run 2,500 lineups, which is what I'm going to be doing on Sunday. That's my pool of entries for, I know I said 500 to 1,000 before. That's because my head's still in baseball. Football, I typically have like a 2,500 lineup pool. And the way that I do that is I'll run sets of 500 at a time with different projections, with different rules or groups, depending on what it is. And then I just pile all of those. I'll move 500 at a clip over into the main tab here. And then I take the main tab, 2,500 lineups out of a Fantasy Cruncher, put it into Excel, and go through my sorting process, which is a different topic. So that's how you move lineups around. You can obviously sort anything that you drop into upload data. Let's say we had put the boom in there. Boom should be here. I probably need to reload the page. Sometimes you do that if you use upload data. If I reloaded the page right now, since we have boom in there, boom would appear as a sort option, but we've only got it on Patrick Mahomes, so it would only be relevant there. If you want to see different data on these cards, you just hit that little wheel, and you've got all this different data in here. One that is interesting, at least to check, I think, sometimes, is the random projection used button. And that'll tell you, all right, we told Fantasy Cruncher to get random with things. So what projection did it actually use for us? And here's one. This one was run with randomness. So we can see the default projection for Lamar was 26.52. The randomness that we had on, I think it was 75% or something heavy. Oh, actually, no, maybe I did run this with that. Yeah, this one ran. This was the one we just ran. So this one ran with randomness, with heavy randoms on, with 75% for everybody. So that ran Lamar all the way out to a 44.82. Ran Mike Davis up to 20. So it's giving you scores that are more in line with like what these guys actually will do in their outlier games. Obviously, it's a monster score for Lamar Jackson, but it'll give you scores in line with, all right, Derrick Henry went out. He had that nice game. He scored a couple touchdowns. He ran for 100 yards. Chris Godwin caught a couple TD passes, and it gives you a nice total here. So you can see how that lineup comes together just differently and what the randomized projections were. You can drop ownership into this, or ownership's there by default. You can drop the different Fantasy Cruncher projections, the different Fantasy Cruncher ceiling projections. For anybody wondering, all of these different values, the ceiling, the adjustments in base value, the averages, the standard deviations, these are all Fantasy Cruncher data points. You can add Awesemo's projection in here. So if you're running a set with your projections and then a set with Alex's projections, Awesemo's projections, and you want to compare the two for each lineup, see how they look, you can do that. These are going to be the same because Awesemo's projections were my projections in this case. So just another way of looking at these lineup cards. You can also change your view. You can go into a grid view. And a lot of people like looking at the lineups like this. Right? It just gives you little informational tabs here. You can choose which columns are displayed. This is basically personal preference. I like the lineup cards. It might just be because I'm more traditional. That's what I'm used to. But that's the way I like it. You can save your crunches over here. Create an empty crunch. That's something that also is worth looking at real quick. Let's say this is my 2,500 lineup pool, and I'm scrolling through it, and there's a couple that just stand out to me for whatever reason. Oh, for the fun ones, right? Yeah, you got to have a couple fun ones in there. So, oh wow, I want to make sure I have at least one Daniel Jones lineup because I'm a Giants fan and I'm a homer. So I'll be scrolling around. Oh, there's my Daniel Jones lineup. Let me grab that real quick. If I wanted to make sure that I got it and saved it, you create an empty crunch right there, right? And then you can just move it over. Move that guy over to the empty crunch that I created. Now it's not an empty crunch anymore. It's just got that one lineup. And then I would just export that or just remember to come back to it and manually enter it later, whatever you want to do with it. But that's just a thing that I like to do. And it's handy to know that you can create empty crunches over here. You can duplicate a crunch. I don't know necessarily why. The empty crunch is a powerful one, though, if it's just, I want to remember to come back and look at these. But remember, then they will be removed from this pool of lineups. You could also do, if you want to keep that lineup in this pool, but move it over there for experimenting with changing maybe one or two players and then putting it back. What you want to do is copy it instead of moving it, right? So I'll copy this one to Crunch 7. Now we're here. Let's say, all right, I don't want to go Saquon. Let's say I want to go Gibson. And I want to go, instead of Van, I want to go with Anthony Schwartz. Right? Now I've got that lineup is different than it was when it came over here. Say I want to move it back so that it's in my primary pool over there. No, it's not still. Oh, why did that not save? That's odd. And it still has Anthony Schwartz. If I want to move it back, there we go. Don't know why it didn't detect it as different that first time. So now I've moved that back over here, and I've got that lineup in my main pool as well. So that's just if you want to move, you like the looks, you like how one is put together, and you want to make a couple different versions of it with a few, 2v2 swaps. That's how you would do something like that, and then pop it back into your overall pool for your sort, or for if you're just running 150 in here for your export. And that's certainly another way to do this. You don't have to do the gigantic pool of lineups and then export it to Excel and et cetera, et cetera. You can just get in here and create a pool of 150 lineups kind of manually, kind of using that process, right? So I just want to say, let's just name that. That's how you name your crunches, by the way. Hit the little pencil there. Right. So if that's my pool of entries, then this can be my lab where I'm making changes, right? So this one I'll say, let's go with some Russ in there. And we want to get one of Russ's pass catchers in here, which I don't know if we have the salary for, but let's just pretend. Let's pretend I made that change. Running out of steam here, I think. So this is where you can lab things like that out. And then again, you can select it. And then if you want to copy it back, right, copy that one over. That one's in that other pool now, and I can continue to make other adjustments here. So let's say I wanted to go with Davis, and I wanted to go with Godwin there. And I don't think the Broncos are going to do well, so I want to go there. And now I'm running a wide receiver with his defense. That's fine. Who cares? And I'll copy this one back over. And now we're just building a little pool of lineups, right? We're obviously doing this on the fly. Don't enter these lineups. All right, so now we've just got our building pool gradually. You can crunch. You can add additional lineups to this pool by doing this. All right, these are all pretty basic things. All right, so now you've just got more to play with, and you can sort them around, sort them by the projected ones. So I find the next top lineups in here. You can move them over, you make changes, et cetera, et cetera. Do all these different things to your heart's content. Let's see. We've covered a lot of this stuff. Exporting lineups, once again, just critical. Make sure that you're selecting the right slate, guys. So important. The actions tab, this is just a quick, easy way to, if you want to get the player list, if you want to reset your thumbs, remove your projections, they put a lot of that power into what we saw over here with the restore default settings now. But that's just a quick, easy way to strip them out. If you want to limit the number of players that are shown in the window above here, you can do that here. Or if you're only getting, a couple of people had this problem after the update, they were only seeing 10, 20 players at a time. This is why. Just select all players here. Or don't, depending on how you want it to work. I think that is the long and short of Fantasy Cruncher NFL, guys. So I'm going to check out after this and wind down the show here. But I appreciate everybody tuning in. Hit the like button. It may or may not matter. I'm not really sure, but I'll appreciate it if you do. This will be up for a long time, hopefully. So hopefully it'll stay evergreen on the site. Any questions that you have, anything that comes along, find me in Slack, TMcB74 in our Slack. I'm always happy to talk shop, to answer questions. I love talking about Fantasy Cruncher and building lineups. Check out my groups article on the site every Thursday and Sunday morning. It'll take you through all of these different things so you don't have to remember this. You can always refer back to this video, but I'll take you through the various rules and limits and the groups that I'm making week by week for each week. So I hope you guys got something out of the video here. Certainly did a lot of talking. Need to go refill my coffee and get to the rest of my day. Have a good one, everybody. Thank you very much.